All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm a member of the event organizing team and a moderator for this session. I want to make everyone aware for this event that live transcription is available, and in order to see it, you can go to the bottom menu bar on your Zoom and select subtitles. In dreaming of this event, our team was inspired by words adapted from Project NIA. Abolitionist futures are not compatible with white supremacy, settler colonialism, misogyny, heterosexism, transphobia, ableism, and classism. Yet these systems of oppression are all around us and affect even this event space. The hope our team has for this session is that organizers, presenters, and participants, particularly those of us who carry a lot of privilege, are mindful of the differential impacts of power and have the courage to hold to account anyone here who exercises power in ways that enact harm. If one of our organizers does remove you from this session, this is not our intention to punish nor to exclude you, but to practice care for the abolitionist community we are building. I'm very excited to be moderating this morning's session. We have some fabulous speakers here with us this morning. But before we begin, I would like to hand it over to Sharon Cheryl, who will give us a few sentences about what the title is.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sharon Cheryl Onga Nana. And at the top of the website page, you see the words Reimagining Abolition. And we wanted to name this particular session Abolish Carceral Imaginations because we wanted to engage in the problem. At the level of imagination, what exactly are the paradigms of violence that we're trying to abolish? So hopefully we will be able to have that discussion during the Q&A portion. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, with that in mind, I'm excited to announce our first presenter, Aatika Singh. Aatika is a Delhi-based artist. She is currently pursuing a master's degree in arts and aesthetics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her primary research is about the intersections of art history and the anti-caste movement. Her previous projects were based on gender, mental health, and marginality. She has been working on a series of protest art at the ongoing farmers' protest in Tikri Kalan. She finished her law graduation from National University of Judicial Sciences, Kolkata, in 2018, after which she was employed with Navania Publishing briefly. She is passionate about her alternative cinema, language, and rural activism traditions. Thank you so much, and please welcome Aatika.
Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. I will begin my presentation with a slide. Please let me know when you can see it. The Indian carceral system is the hierarchical afterlife of its legal justice edifice centered on caste divide. This photo essay aims to document the unfolding speciality and historicity of prison houses in India vis-a-vis caste. It intends to decenter photographic construction as a predatory form of apparatus on the lives of marginalized bodies. This is the first photograph in the working series. Its title, Flame of the Forest, is derived from the season of spring. I clicked this in. The location is an outer boundary of a prison house and the time is early afternoon. Here, the barbed wires act as a metaphor of the carceral process. The juxtaposition of heavy foliage of palash trees represents the swelling numbers of dissent within and without the system. The dimensions of policing in India are truly mind-boggling, in complete resemblance to the photograph. The azure of the sky for me is the one element that embodies an Ambedkarite emancipation by borrowing from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's work on equality. That is also the theoretical framework of this working paper. The paper attempts to build an empirical and experiential ethnographic photographic journey in prison complexes and foregrounds. the research methodology in an anti-caste framework. The foremost reasons for this entry are due to the fact that Indian jails have an overrepresentation of two particular marginalized communities, Dalits and Muslims. Both the groups form a historically oppressed continuum with the Brahminical terrain of Indian society. The justification isn't criminal at all in nature, but rather sociological, where the Hindu codes bound marginalized lives to a system of penury and pollution. The cyclical viciousness ends up rendering our lives as bare, as Agamben had elucidated, as lives devoid of all legal and social rights and remedies. Although from my own lived experience, what emerges is that prison living is also about solidarity. The site encapsulates a transformative potential with reference to human life, identity, and ideology. It is also important to mention here that since post 2013, Indian prisons have also been witnessing a rising number of students, journalists, activists, lawyers, and intellectuals from the progressive ideological leanings of left in its compound. Through these photographs, I hope I'm able to conceive a narrative of assertion and empowerment. Violence Collides is a photographic work that was captured in a fleeting moment inside a prison complex in an autumn night. In India, darkness is not simply a shade, but rather a structure. If the fascist laws here are called as black laws, the terminology extends beyond and goes towards the human realm. Black people are often met with brutal violence, and encounters with the police are commonplace. The homogeneous Hindu land then becomes a conduit for the merciless stereotyping and criminalization of everybody that doesn't fit the normative categorization. The explosive black of the photograph here then acts as an intersectional medium to draw other communities into the picture, facing the same experience across the globe, primarily the Black and the Latinx community. It is also a way for me to present forth a metaphor of agency, where the directly affected communities should be the leading voice in any movement that calls for abolition. Coming back to the Indian terrain, I have quoted certain facts that stare hard at the complex reality in front of us. These facts don't just highlight the intermixed histories of caste, gender, labor, and the nation state, but also put in focus the colonial legal systems that most nations are still governed by, creating large scale impoverishment. This is not to deny the state-wise efforts at legal amendments of prison rules and statutes, but to say that the condition remains deplorable, especially in the light of COVID-19 virus, in which prison capacities are exploding and lives are being put at severe risk. Prisoners are being refused even essential necessities like spectacles, books, zippers, and copy of their legal orders. The message for me is quite clear that abolition as a communitarian goal cannot wait any further. The orange is rotten shifts the dialogue from the receiver to the giver. The police personnel, I feel, are an essential part of the conversation. This narrative was especially witnessed in the current farmers' movement in India against three fascist agricultural laws that aim to privatize the entire agricultural sector, wherein a few policemen refused to assault the protesters due to various ethical concerns. The image, though, for me, reflects a certain passiveness that gets highly embroiled in their professional carrying out of delegated tasks, where violence is allowed to be constructed and unleashed. Coming to certain recent sociological and legal facts allows us to take a deeper penetrative look into the system of caste and incarceration, and it also debunks certain commonly held myths. The juxtaposition of these facts against the photographs becomes highly crucial, especially since for the past few years, there has been repeated police and state violence on students, migrant laborers, in universities where firing has been brazenly ordered, and inside the house of marginalized community people for manufactured baseless reasons like possession of meat or drinking water from a temple tap. Hence, none of this exists in any isolated vacuum in the context of feudal Indian society. Please let me know if I need to stay on a slide if anyone hasn't read it yet. Moving on, I find this to be like an interesting photograph because this daily store is inside a prison house and the owner is affiliated to the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. On the blackboard, the Devanagari script reads, "Heartiest congratulations to Sri Narendra Modi on his birth anniversary." Modi is the right-wing authoritarian Prime Minister of India since 2013. The message is followed by an environmentalist quote. On the very surface, this wouldn't look like a prison image at all, but it succeeds for me in a way in reflecting the ideological ties of the state with the legal system by roping in the business classes. This slide is not working for some reason, but these slides had some other facts to bring forth the exact nexus wherein a frontal picture can be understood of the entire system, the bedrock of which needs to be abolished. Various hierarchies play in the doubling of impoverishment effect on the bare lives of caste bodies. I'll read out the text of the slide myself. Just give me a minute, please. The text says that counter cases are often filed against marginalized caste who may have filed a case under SC/ST Atrocity Act. The same persons get profiled repeatedly as in the case of denotified tribes. Second, the percentage of under trial prisoners confined for more than 3 years has increased by 140% since 2000. India's prisons are overcrowded with an average occupancy rate of 118.5% in 2019, out of which 66.51% are illiterate. To compound this, the number of SC, ST, and OBC judges and lawyers remain completely abysmal. This is another photograph from the series, which is inside a prison room. All the elements in the image are a telltale sign of the psychological, sexual, and economic impact that incarceration has on people, especially a marginalized person. There is a visible lack of resources and care in the inmate's life. These jails are full of many marked bodies whose only fault remains that the society they inhabit in failed to have a preventive approach towards treatment, crime, and governance, and a reformative one as well. This image is from a daily morning routine followed inside a major prison complex in a metropolitan city in India. Almost all prisons here delegate labor based on caste identity, as we saw in one of the previous slides. Prisons then also become sites where the most abhorrent practices like manual scavenging, wherein a person from the Dalit community has to go and clean the septic tank and gutters by their hands without uniform and any tools. These practices get institutionalized apart from other practices that are linked to one caste occupation like cutting hair, cleaning the dishes, cleaning the toilets, etc. We can see in the image a linear hierarchy emerging from the three figures dotting the line. Children often also are abused and embroiled in the same casteist professions. The photograph here was clicked on an autumn early morning. The two adjacent elements represent vulnerability and marginality. The cracks in the image make the flower sit gingerly on itself. I'm always reminded of the precarity that caste bodies carry through this delicate image.
Aatika, I would like to give you a time notice.
How much time do I have left?
A little bit less than 5 minutes.
Okay. This photograph has a defiance of a central gaze. The effect is to propel thought and care towards the documentation of lives at the periphery of normative institutions of incarceration. They are about desires and put together constitute a guideline for the Indian jail as a site of aspiration and solidarity. What emerges is the renunciation of design and materialization of the texture of atmosphere. These photographs cannot be deconstructed. They refuse to be taken home. therefore are liberatory, alike the goal of abolition and coming together of a beloved community. One of the last photographs in the series, this was taken right before the 6 puppies died due to starvation and abuse inside a prison house. I've taken the title from a Sylvia Plath poem, wherein she says that she wants to go to this country, which is, she keeps thinking about this country which is as far away as health. And that poem has always, whenever I've read that poem, it has always made me feel like how classical photography's central pillar in projecting the jail is sort of this victim image, and how that poem beautifully deconstructs victimhood. This is the last amateur image photograph for today, and I believe it speaks for itself. I had clicked this on the dawn of the morning I was released out of incarceration. I'll conclude here. I'll end my presentation, and I just extend my solidarity to all fellow abortionists through this work. Thank you.
Wow, beautiful, beautiful images and such great words to accompany them. Thank you so much, Aatika. We now will move into, we have a few minutes for any questions and conversation with Aatika. So for this, if you would like to have your question read, you can put it in the chat and I can read it out loud for you. Otherwise, you can raise your hand or just write your name in the chat and we will unmute you.
I have a quick question for Aatika. Can you hear me, Aatika?
Yes, I can.
Thank you so much for positioning yourself in the work. And this is just out of curiosity. Someone like myself, I'm Black, I'm African. How would I be treated within the caste system?
Yes, thank you for that question, Sharon. I think the way I would have my take on the question is not how would you be treated within the caste system, because I would say that the moment anyone enters India, for that matter, they're already sort of playing and putting themselves within a caste society. So any treatment that is meted out to them is a reaction that comes from our own identical position in that system, from our own identities. It is definitely a very unsafe place for all marginalized communities, especially if one can be recognized by their names or by their look. uh, I'm sorry, like this is not a very positive answer. It's not a very hopeful one, in fact. But I've grown seeing a lot of violence being met out to non-Indians who've come here, and they sort of stand out. So yeah, caste system is brutal to outsiders, and through the process of Brahminical Hinduization, what happens usually is that either there is a co-option, either, and these days there are laws that are being brought in to sort of stop religious uh, conversion to any egalitarian measure like Buddhism. So the options of exits are also very less. So it's a hierarchical terrain with a lot of inequality and impunity.
You are muted now.
I have a question. Can you say a little bit about the process of selecting the images that you selected? They were actually really aesthetically interesting. I'm just wondering how you go about looking for those.
Yes, thank you for that question. I would say like it's not something that it's not a very deliberate conscious choice of trying to look for photographs that could represent marginality, especially in an incarceral system. But what I would say was that I was haunted by my experience of incarceration, and I tried writing about it, but I think like the images I've clicked after and before do sort of kind of deliver more justice to my experience. And just want to like put it out there, like I'm not a trained photograph, so the choice has never been driven by any technicalities or any format as such, but mostly the subject matter and how I could best convey what's there, ideologically as well as contextually. So that's the process I'm guided by. And if it could just help me put across the message to like a wider audience and not just restricted to marginalized communities, if a conversation can be built around not just on aesthetics, though all aesthetics is about politics, but also about uh, the underneath of these photographs, you know, the under the theoretical underpinnings and also the praxis that I wanted to put across. That's my answer.
Thank you for that response. It appears as though we have a question from Michael, and then we will have to save the rest of the questions for any extra time we have at the end.
Thank you very much, Aatika. I wanted to say that I really enjoyed your presentation. In the organizing team, we have a gentleman, Shalish, who has been using a phrase that I have been especially attracted to about social identity-based supremacies. Of course, this includes the racial, that includes the caste. And what I really liked about your presentation was that it brings to the forefront caste, because this is actually something that for myself as a European North American habiting person, it's such a rare opportunity to reflect on. I've been seeing through scholarship work that I've been doing, working very much at looking at the international construction of penal abolition, and I'm really developing a much finer appreciation for the plurality of voices that abolition entails. And I think your emphasis on caste, and I really appreciate the way you constructed your photographs and what you have clearly avoided doing. I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, it's sort of very difficult to have a affirmative, positive conversation about caste dynamics in India. And I mean, the pleasure is all mine to have an opportunity here on this platform.
I think that is echoed by many of us to thank you. Shailesh would like to actually respond to Sharon Cheryl's question, and then we will move on to our next presenter.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Thanks, Sharon Cheryl, for that question. And that's very, very important. And I think what we have been discussing since the beginning is about, multiple visions of abolition. But yes, the relationship between race and caste, I think it's been very long. The debate around that is going since very long. And if I can bring in the question which you had asked about how would, say, a Black African would be considered in that caste hierarchy, or say in India, I can give certain examples, both social and legal. And very quickly, of course. So say in the Indian Constitution, when we talk about right to equality, we have now, we have race as well as one of the grounds on which no one should be discriminated. But then coming to the social aspect or the practices, so we have had definitely instances in India, including in capital Delhi, where violence has been met, as in the Black Africans or people from African countries who have moved to India have been met with violence, even within India, because of course India has people from different racial identity. So even say if I'll talk about, say, northeastern part of India, then even they had faced different forms of violence. And many times it has been considered, that the question of belongingness, that, when we talk about or imagine India, or when this, you can say, as Aatika was talking about, the Brahminical or the caste system. So when that is imagined, they are not considered as part of India, or centered around India. So I think, again, it's a very complex question to have a kind of coherent answer. But I can I hope that I did answer your question to certain extent by citing these examples. Thank you so much.
Great. And hopefully we will have time at the end to continue this conversation. But for now, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Daria Nacero.
Yeah, thanks so much to the organizers. Thank you, Aatika, for that super beautiful presentation. Unfortunately, I think mine will focus a little bit more on the bad side of things, but hopefully we'll get to some abolitionist futures at the end. Yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I have a little slide presentation. So I'm gonna just dive right in, and then hopefully we can get to some of the things that I kind of gloss over in the question and answer. So what I hope to discuss today is what we might crudely refer to as the next iteration of the carceral state, or a certain digital horizon of the carceral state. So taking up the genealogy that many have laid out, addressing the transformation of the dominant form of racial domination from chattel slavery through Jim Crow to mass incarceration, many are now articulating a confrontation in the current system, causing it to have to take new form. As the fiscal and social unsustainability of the behemoth warehousing model of incarceration becomes undeniable, austerity and now the coronavirus strains budgets, and social movements pressure legislators, a bipartisan ruling class consensus is developing as to the necessity of confronting so-called mass incarceration. In order to solve what we are told is this new pressing issue, we are increasingly confronted with various technological alternatives. Smart weapons, body cameras, evidence and case management platforms, gunshot detection systems, data synthesis and analysis software, predictive policing and decision support technology, proprietary algorithmic risk assessment, CCTV cameras, automated license plate readers, and even literal robot cops are all designed and marketed to appear to address the problems of mass incarceration and police brutality. In reality, they are the products of public-private partnerships bringing together investors, tech companies, universities, and police and correctional departments to develop and deploy new technologies to track, collect, store, and analyze data on targeted populations, turning what used to be the infamous million-dollar blocks into digital prisons of their own. Instead of costing the state millions, these blocks are recast as markets that can make millions for private enterprise, capitalizing on calls for reform. These technologies extend the surveillance and punitive apparatus into communities in both racialized and racializing ways, mutating the means of social control from beat cops and jail cells to data mining and ankle monitors. So in this presentation, I want to suggest 3 potentially fruitful ways of considering these new kind of techno modalities, and new and not so new, right? Like obviously we'll talk about the way in which they're part of a long legacy of kind of biopolitical activity, and then also how they've been around for many of them now going on a few decades. So first, I want to analyze them as a part of the legacy of enclosures. Then I want to draw out the way in which they generalize the prison to clarify their potential connection with the project of extractive urban restructuring, or what we might call gentrification. Finally, before positing the directions we as abolitionists can take to confront these forces, I want to consider how they seek to direct us towards a sort of apartheid state. So I want to first just look at some examples. So Hunch Lab, a predictive policing system developed by Azavia, a proudly mission-driven certified B Corporation, and later acquired by ShotSpotter, infamous in cities like Oakland, describes itself as a patrol management system that uses statistical geospatial modeling to forecast when and where crimes are likely to occur and support law enforcement in figuring out the best way to respond. Hunch Lab's algorithms synthesize data across space-time to inform police patrols. Drawing on climatology and weather patterns, days of the week, time of the year, and time of the day, socioeconomic indicators such as business types and concentration of public transit, as well as area income and educational levels, and of course, crime reports, Hunch Lab recommends specific blocks on which police should concentrate their attention and times of the day during which to do so. It also incorporates projection as to which crimes are most likely to be preventable by police patrol. Police are equipped with tablets and smartphones displaying dynamic, interactive GPS maps of HunchLab's recommendations. Beyond the fact that algorithmic technologies based on racialized data will produce racialized outcomes, as we all know, weaponizing neighborhood infrastructure, culture, through its consideration of holidays, time of the day and calendar, and even the weather to strengthen and widen the net of state surveillance and punishment, we must remember, along with scholars like R. Joshua Scannell, who writes specifically about HunchLab, and others, that policing itself is the original racist technology, in the sense that policing makes race. And through identifying racialized categories with something called crime, policing is likewise criminogenic. The racializing and criminogenic projects of policing are in fact coextensive. Without policing, it would be impossible to imagine both race and crime as such, phenomena inextricably linked in their relationship to capital. An operative aspect of HunchLab's algorithm is the designation of whether crimes are in fact preventable by police. This creates a subconscious category of what constitutes real crime. Petty theft, assault, armed robbery, burglary, illicit transactions, in short, street crime, come to constitute the category of the criminal, while things like embezzlement, tax fraud, etc., in short, white-collar crimes, are epistemologically decriminalized. So through spatializing the reproduction of race and crime, predictive policing technology creates racialized borders to designate risky zones and populations to be disciplined and controlled by the state and capital. Logics of risk and preemption have long been deployed to justify carceral violence against racialized populations. We might consider, for instance, the many war on poverty programs launched in the 1960s that focused their attention on at-risk youth that the state deemed to be at risk of entering into criminality in the future. In channeling these youth into neighborhood programs staffed and run by police, they ensured that these youth would be captured in the web of state surveillance from an early age, making them increasingly vulnerable to the punitive apparatus in adulthood. Rather than preventing crime then, the police effectively created crime, created the category of the criminal, and those they deemed potentially risky were dealt with in such a way so as to assure the realization of this projection, a sinister confirmation bias condemning thousands to long prison sentences when they reached adulthood, and the war on poverty naturally mutated into the war on crime. Predictive policing thus deepens the historic work of policing that territorializes risk and seeks to preempt, not necessarily prevent, its realization. In short, these are not new phenomena, and they simply digitize and automate a long legacy of biopolitical war against subjects deemed potentially threatening to the hegemony of capital. Also weapons in that war, algorithmic risk assessment and electronic monitoring work hand in hand to displace the costs of surveillance and punishment onto communities and further entrench racialized and racializing risk as a factor to be monitored and controlled. In response to calls to reform cash bail, algorithmic risk assessment technologies consider a person's educational, housing, employment, and criminal background, among other factors, to make recommendations and, in some cases, decisions about sentencing, bail, and probation or parole conditions. Reformist narratives seek to convince us that this will make bail and sentencing processes more fair. Rather than simply incarcerating the poor pre-trial because they can't pay bail, the algorithm will decide whether it thinks they pose a risk to the community or a flight risk in order to make decisions about incarceration or release. However, as we all are well aware, the data itself reproduces patterns of racial and class stratification that constitute the carceral state as such. Algorithmic risk assessment thus deepens the violence of the bail and sentencing systems, assuring certain citizens, white, affluent, educated, relative safety from the brutality of the carceral state, while condemning others, Black, Indigenous, poor, non-citizens, who will always already be deemed risky to all the violence of the dynamic. Oh. Maybe others can mute themselves. I'm hearing some audio coming through from a different to all the violence of the dynamic, punitive, and surveillance apparatus, either making certain sentences or pretrial detention unavoidable, or with alternate forms of incarceration like electronic monitoring. Electronic monitoring usually takes the form of an ankle bracelet that functions as a GPS tracker. When a person is released on an electronic monitor or issued an electronic monitor in any situation, they may be spatially constrained from either entering certain parts of a city or from leaving others. Their home itself may become their cell, or they'll be allowed to go to work or school to continue to be, exploited as a worker or build up their human capital, but not participate in other activities. The device might log the proximity and duration that it spends in relation to other devices, thus mapping the relationships of so-called offenders. Electronic monitoring can therefore digitize the relational policing that stops people with certain conditions of probation or parole from interacting with other so-called offenders, solidifying the communal fragmentation and degradation of the social fabric that the carceral state both deploys as a means and realizes as an end of population and risk management. By bringing entire social networks under surveillance through tracking the movements of the person wearing the device, the digital panopticon proliferates in a fractal and nodal way, sweeping up whole neighborhoods in a more strategically targeted and actionable modality than the generalized dragnet surveillance. Additionally, it is people wearing the devices who are charged for their maintenance and upkeep, for the massive profits corporations are generating from their use. Sometimes as expensive as $25 a day or more. With incarceration. I mean, the people don't always have to pay for them, but often they do. With incarceration as a penalty for non-payment, surveilled subjects become raw materials for capitalist extraction and are trapped in cycles of debt and incarceration. Not only then does the deployment of digital punitive actuarial technologies solidify and expand the surveillance state, it also functions as an extractive mechanism, generating capital through both proprietary criminogenic data and money revenue from its exploits. Here we might think with scholars like Andrea Miller to uncover a mutual weaving of both common genealogies and shared teleologies between speculative finance and carceral technologies. The most widely used proprietary risk assessment algorithms are derived from actuarial models used in the insurance industry. The manufactured clairvoyance of speculative finance, in which projections about the future are made to be acted upon in the present, and those actions therefore shape that future, manipulating outcomes in order to maximize returns, maps sympathetically onto the function of projected risk and preemption in predictive policing. So dancing alongside peers like discriminatory insurance schemes, payday lending, and the predatory mortgage industry, electronic monitoring, algorithmic risk assessment, and predictive policing technologies carve up the city to designate zones of extraction and capture. These reformist technologies are developed to generalize their impact, masking their targeting of certain subjects in the territorialization of their projects. In doing so, they effectively criminalize entire neighborhoods and communities along racial lines, transforming them into plantations for the production of proprietary biometric data, and justifying and bolstering and occupying police state presence. We can understand this occupation through the lens of enclosures in order to apprehend the role policing in general and its punitive and surveillance technologies in particular play in what we might term extractive urban restructuring and gentrification. As predictive policing creates zones of risk and concentrated police response and occupation, as electronic monitoring constrains and dictates people's movements, and as data synthesis and analysis platforms convert whole neighborhoods into fields of geospatial statistical accumulation, communities are enclosed and people are dispossessed of their lives and ability to live. Through this carceral algorithmic necropolitics, incarceration and policing clarify as forms of accumulation by dispossession, extracting people from their communities, extracting revenue through fines and fees, and extracting profit through industry development and investment. People's lives in common are foreclosed and their subjectivities and territories converted into data points with exchange value on the market, weaponized by capital and the state in keeping them maximally extractable and exploitable. Considering the mass displacement of Black, Indigenous, and poor communities from increasingly capitalized urban spaces, often described under the moniker gentrification, we can see the carceral geographies birthed and imposed by digitized enclosure functioning as part of the racialized dispossession in the neoliberal city. While evictions and foreclosures, luxury condos, and expensive business and office districts mark the real estate side of extractive urban restructuring, pricing out undesirable poor and working class residents to facilitate market development with the settlement of professionals with disposable incomes, policing functions to clear urban space in another complementary way, and digitized and actuarial policing technologies automate the analog functions of policing. As I like to say, the invisible hand of the market is the state, and it wears a tactical glove. We might consider, for instance, the role of policing through gang injunctions in relation to gentrification in Oakland. In 2010, in the midst of a brutal housing crisis, Oakland instituted gang injunctions the city claimed would help break up violent gang activity and make communities safer. The injunctions limited the mobility and public presence of neighborhood residents registered on gang databases in various ways. That they had curfews, they couldn't go out after a certain time, they couldn't gather in public with a certain amount of other people, things like this. Many scholars and activists, most notably, I've learned from Margaret Ramirez and Courage, have spoken incisively about the role of gang injunctions in gentrification, pointing out that the areas placed under injunctions were not, in fact, the most impacted by violent crime in Oakland, but rather were neighborhoods adjacent to or that served as commuter passages for gentrifying neighborhoods surrounding them. Dispossessing people of the ability to move freely in their neighborhood erases them from their territory for the sake of the gentrifying white imaginary, even as they are still present, and degrades their quality of life and ability to live so as to create affective pressures to move, as in leave. The gang injunctions sought to demonstrate that these neighborhoods were no longer theirs. Similar initiatives have been deployed around the country. In Oakland, massive community organization defeated the gang injunctions, as analogous initiatives in other cities like LA and San Jose have also been challenged. And so the state and capital must pivot. It must sanitize. How might we see the city's defeated attempt at mobilizing spatialized gang injunctions to police communities of color in gentrifying neighborhoods in a place like Oakland being rebirthed and recreated in digitized injunction zones through proprietary actuarial technologies? As the state deploys technologies like predictive policing and electronic monitoring to surveil and channel racialized subjects through digitally secured landscapes and coded spaces, cordoning off certain areas and constraining people to others, designating certain zones as risky and to be occupied by police, their residents extracted from through dispersed fee-bearing surveillance technology, we might see how the next iteration of the carceral state comes to be synonymous with gentrification and iterative of apartheid logics. So the South African apartheid regime was a political, legal, economic, and social system meant to codify racial stratification, organize it territorially, and use it to facilitate labor exploitation and to mitigate the threat Black people inherently pose to white hegemony. The apartheid regime also created so-called homelands for Black South Africans, systematically removing millions from newly designated, or we could say enclosed, white spaces and relegating them to impoverished hinterlands, from which the past laws dictated they could only leave with a work permit to either go to the mines or into white space as a servant or laborer. Through the lens of the apartheid regime, we can perceive clearly the patterns of displacement and containment realized by the carceral state through digital technologies. We might see how the perfect cocktail of electronic monitoring, predictive policing, and biometric data synthesis and analysis software effectively instantiate digitized colorblind pass laws for extractive urban restructuring, displacing people from their communities even as they may be constrained within them, and displacing the costs of surveillance and punishment onto those communities through fines, fees, and rising cost of living. The territorialization of preemptive punishment and its merging with surveillance as it emanates outwards from the prison, jail, and detention facility to permeate geographies and subjectivities facilitates extractive urban restructuring and gentrification by offering new means of population management, social control, enclosure, and capital accumulation. Understanding the sanitized, colorblind, technological solutions to the problems of mass incarceration and police brutality as instances and projects of enclosure and intimately bound up with the settler colonial and capitalist nation state, we might then posit, along with thinkers like Robin D.G. Kelley, the reclamation of the commons, or go even further to the necessary extent and say communization as a potential basis for revolutionary transnational abolitionist praxis. In this work, we must see clearly the material connection between the financialized and punitive plunder of enclosed, read redlined, surveilled, occupied by militarized police, gentrified, targeted for predatory credit, etc., communities domestically, and a global regime of militarized extractive apartheid, as the United States exports its carceral technologies of border securitization based on biometrics and algorithmic planning. Such a consideration reveals the posited abolitionist praxis of communization as enacting a necessarily anti-imperialist, no-border politics. Finally, then, a generative abolition based on a radical reclamation of the commons and communization must be, and we would also say will be and is, an essentially and foundationally reparatory praxis, as the enclosure of land, knowledge, labor, bodies, and ultimately life itself is a fundamentally white supremacist, anti-Black, colonial, anti-Indigenous, and patriarchal project. Thank you, thank you.
Fabulous. Lots to think about there, Darien. Thank you. If anyone has any questions directed at Darien, please ask to unmute yourself or you can place it in the chat.
Yeah, I have a question specifically about the last slide. How are the commons compatible with what was the word, reparatory? Yeah, how, in the sense that the commons sounds like an all lives mattering of sort of the world, whereas I hear reparation sounds more like I guess giving back what is owed. So I'm not very familiar with Robin D.G. Kelley's understanding of the commons. So if you could just tell us, me or anyone else who's interested, how the commons is not an all lives mattering of resources and how reparations fit together.
Sure, yeah, totally. So first, I just, really appreciate that question. I'm gonna just drop in the chat a list of the kind of resources that I drew on in thinking about this stuff, and some of them do address that question. So I just dropped that in the chat, some kind of like stuff for further research. So what I would say is, I think that, okay, so the commons is basically a way of understanding a way in which communities can collectively manage their own social reproduction, right? So colonialism is a project that attempts to eviscerate the commons of indigenous peoples in various ways, right? So I think that there's something inherently anti-colonial, right, about commons and commoning. And you know, when we get to the and the extent from moving from commons to, you know, what I want to gesture at as communization, wants to address the kind of like juridical legal infrastructure that codifies these racial and class stratifications that, you know, we need to address through a reparatory framework, right? And so in destituting that those histories and stepping into the possibility of facilitating people and communities to you know, seize our own free lives, it's essentially an you know, an anti-colonial, anti-racist struggle by necessity, right? And so one way I think of understanding the commons is very much through that lens of seeing it as a reclamation of the land, labor, life, culture, resources, bodies, et cetera, that have been stolen through white supremacist settler colonialism. Yeah, I hope that addresses it a little bit. I can't hear you, Laura.
We have a question from Interfaith Council, if they are able to unmute themselves.
Oh, hello, thanks for that. My name is Desiree. Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation and thinking about kind of how technology is being used. I know I'm part of a group here in Michigan that's working to ban facial recognition usage at the city level and hopefully a spread through the county. One of the things I think about is that a lot of times people use technology as a way, like they bring in, it's a cost, like a cost analysis, like, oh, this might make it like less expensive. And this actually will reduce like, you know, funding for police or things of that sort. So I'm just wondering in terms of if you have any thoughts about the kind, like ways of pushing back against that narrative that technology use will actually reduce policing in some way, because we obviously know it doesn't. So,
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You know, obviously that's kind of, so within the regime of austerity that seeks to like shrink government to its most basic functions and kind of cut all programming that's not basically surveillance and punishment, we come to see the state essentially as, you know, we might understand in classic political philosophy the state as the entity that has the monopoly on violence. And in a kind of neoliberal austerity regime, the state becomes reduced to only that function, right? The state is not that which provides the kind of Keynesian idea that which provides services to the community, that which like cares for its citizens or whatever, like these kind of illusions. And it becomes stripped to just the entity that enacts force upon people to kind of keep them in line, right? And so these appeals to the budget are right in line with that. They're very expressive of this idea that like, oh, you know, we don't have enough resources to spend the amount that we need to spend on, you know, the police in order to discipline and punish our communities, basically. And so classically, you know, outsourcing is what happens, and they contract out with, you know, whatever it is, whether it's facial recognition or these other types of things. And this is very much what I kind of was hoping to get at a little bit, is the way in which both the state is constantly has to adjust to social, economic, political, and increasingly ecological circumstances in order to continue its project of maintaining a concentrated power structure. And so as we see, social movements moving against police brutality and ecological circumstances making things more difficult for governments, they need to constantly shift and pivot, right? And this is how we kind of saw the series of reforms in that genealogy that I started with that's come to be kind of like, really important, between chattel slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. So what's the way in which the state is maneuvering that we have to be aware of as abolitionists in order to respond to? And secondly, obviously, capital is also always doing that, right? So prisons are super expensive, and people have found ways to make a lot of money off of prisons, of course. But yet, capitalism as Hydra that's constantly sprouting new heads and seeking to capture new markets and seeking to subsume new territories into its regime of the commodity form. And so we will consistently see an endless expansion of the ways in which their suffering can be extracted from for capital accumulation. So I think you're absolutely right in getting at the way in which local government, and something, for instance, like Jackie Wang writes about in Carceral Capitalism is the kind of like fee mining that municipalities do on communities, where they basically generate a good amount of revenue through petty fines and fees on people, from their trash cans to expired tags or whatever, and police have quotas that they have to generate a certain amount of revenue through targeting certain populations for those types of fees. And so I think that these dynamics are intimately bound up with this kind of austerity regime and myth that municipal and state governments somehow don't have enough money, right?
Thank you, Darien. I'm going to have to pause it there. It appears as Giuseppe has figured out some technical difficulties, and I would like to pass it on to him. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.
All right, our final speaker for this session is Giuseppe Mosconi. If he is able to be highlighted here.
Okay, good evening to everybody. I'm Giuseppe Mosconi. I'm a retired full professor in sociology of law, University of Padua. And I've been studying about deviance, prisons, and legal reform and things like this. Fear of crime, things like this. So what I want to present tonight is a clear interpretation of the problem of what abolishing prison should be. It is that without taking account the problem of criminal law, of what criminal law is, and how can you deal with it in a perspective of abolition, we cannot think about how to abolish prison. So this is the hardcore of my speech. Can I go on?
Yes, go on.
Okay.
You have 15 minutes.
I think we have to start from considering the abstractions by criminal law, which I have to resume very, very shortly. We have 4 types of abstractions. Abstraction dogmatics, who has to do with the definition of what crime is, the subject psychological attitude who commit crimes, and the values and the goods protected by the criminal law. All that is schematized and summarized in a very schematic and easy way to abstract. The second area of abstraction has to do with the trial and the complex of rules what presume to produce what is the judiciary truth concerning crimes. And this also abstract procedure connected to the truth problem. The third kind of abstractions has to do with the social expectations relating to prison, to crimes and reaction by prison. And these expectations are also schematized as first to prevent revenge as a spontaneous reaction to crimes, So the state have to prevent this private revenge in order don't produce two serious problems in the reaction. And the second is the idea that without prison, we don't have a security. And so the prison is necessary to produce a social security. And the fourth area of abstractions has to do with the function of the punishment, which are the retribution, the re-education, and the prevention. So I can't deal with all these kind of abstractions because, but my idea is that they are very abstract, they are very schematical, and they can't take in account what a reality concerning crime and prison is. So is a construction, abstract and untrue of the reality of the facts, and this separation between the legal definition and the empirical processes is the root of the problem of, concerning the prison. I want to consider the fourth area of abstractions has to do with the functions. And very shortly, I will try just running through my slides, consider the way in which we cannot find any fundament, any real basis of these abstractions of the functions. So if you started considering retribution, the retribution is a very abstract theory who has not any scientific ground. First of all, why? Because we cannot think that every different kind of human action, which is defined as a crime, can be managed with a problem of duration of suffering, the problem of time, so of the punishment, as the only one code summarizing and equalizing all these kind of different events, human events defined as crimes. So there is not any real correspondence between the effects of the crimes and the deprivation of time can be respectable dealing with the problem. Secondly, the second kind of deformation is that there is not any proportionality in with the experiences of the subject involved in the crime fact. Why? Because, of course, the experience of the author of the so-said criminal is a personal experience in his life story, as well as also the experience of the victim is a very particular in his own story. And there is not any correspondence between the two experiences. So even less is possible to equalize, to push them just in the forced schema of deprivation of time, of suffering. So there is not any scientific evidence who can even hypothesize if we consider this kind of a human facts. And then there is also many factors influencing, as you say, the suffering of the prison, which are the kind of prison, the real length of the punishment, but also the social status of the detainee, of the prisoner, and his social conditions, so his social capital, and his culture, and his situation, and everything, his age, of course, and also his degree of instructions like this, scholarship like this. And then we have also other variables who has to do if we have or not pretrial detention, And if we have or not alternative of the imprisonment and a certain point of the punishment in prison. Because all these aspects, we can't think about retribution as a meaningful description of the foundation, the roots, the founded explication of what punishment is. So if we go on and we try to consider if education is founded, we have many aspects we can orient ourselves to take in account that it is not possible any re-education in the prison. First of all, because there is a big low ambiguity between the idea of treatment and the idea of discipline, in a sense that they are exchangeable. Sometimes discipline is enough to have a suitable treatment. Sometimes treatment is considered as a resource to lead to the people, to the prisoner, to a disciplined behavior, disciplined behavior. So anyway, what's prevailing is the idea of well-organized life and well-controlled overall life inside the prison, and a very tight form of discipline as a sort of self-production of the prison institution. And the second aspect is the well-known lack of resources and the insufficiency of professionals of treatment, considering in comparison with the number of prisoners. And overall also it's very important to consider the deformation in a suitable pedagogical relationship should be developed in the prison. First of all, because it is an imposed education, so we can't, especially with adult people, think about educational experience which is imposed and not freely chosen. The secondly is also a very artificial situation, because the prison is not, of course, or as the opposite of the normal life. And so we cannot think to re-educate people in a different reality, totally subversive in comparison with, which is the normal way of life outside. And thirdly, we cannot, you have to take in account that the natural reaction to the sentence and to the stigma of criminal is the reaction of this blaming process, and so reevaluate his own identity as an original one, included also the illegal choose the illegal tendencies. And also there is a very ambiguous relationship between the professional of treatment and the prisoners, because the professionals has to exercise the double function of helping and controlling, while the criminals or the prisoners anyway, they show themselves as abiding with the expectations of the professionals, while they mainly do that in order to to have a better detention situation, a shorter period of punishment. So also the motivation is very ambiguous and instrumental. And also we can have this kind of paradox which has to do with recidivity. The effect of this, of course, is already clear by the fact that just we have less than 30% of people who does not repeat crimes after the prison, while more than 70% repeat crimes. And it's first evident proof that education is not efficient in the prison experience. And but there is the paradox that as more you repeat the crime, as longer and longer period of punishment you have to suffer. So it's a real subversive approach to a scientific analysis of the social processes. And so also we have to consider that the big majority of the prisoners are not suitable for education program. Why? Because drug addicts that in the Italian reality are more than the 30% of the prisoners, they need more healing treatment, medical treatment, or personal psychological treatment, which is very different, of course, from the prison experience. While the other 30% of prisoners who are immigrants, legal and illegal, essentially they need for a job, they need for wage and the means of sufficient life, and they are persecuted just because they are illegal immigrants. So, of course, this is not the right answer to their situation, their problem. And then all that happened in the crisis of welfare state, which, of course, is the start point of policies oriented in readmission, re-inclusion in the society of people who has some kind of problem, like all the prisoners are. So, because all these prisons, we can think reasons we can't think about prison as a suitable mean for re-education. Just
Giuseppe,
the opposite.
sorry, Giuseppe, you have
okay.
two more minutes. Thanks.
2 more minutes?
Yeah.
I see. Oh, I couldn't believe that it was such a short time. Anyway, just I go fast, maybe 5 minutes if it's possible, to the end. Prevention, there is also any scientific evidence concerning prevention, because for the simple reason that we can't analyze the trend of the crimes, because black number, and because the trend of crimes is connected to the crime reports. So it means that it's more the idea of efficient intervention in the crime phenomenon, which is show just the opposite of the idea of increasing criminality, is increasing institutional control against crimes who stay in a big, large, and unanalyzable black number. Just for that, we can, there is, as you can see, many other reasons, but we can't give any explication, any respect of the idea of prevention. Okay, since I have to finish, I want to go directly. Maybe I can leave you in I send you my slides, and I go directly to the idea of abolishing prison. Because of that, because also the prison also today has nothing to do with the classical idea of criminal law, has been conceived as a sort of guarantees against the violence of the states in the origin. Today, the punishment is just a symbolic function, to mainly a symbolic function to construct the a bad, negative image of the public enemies, and to exclude the weak part of society from normal relation, to protect the middle class society from people who has big difficulties for their life. So construct this penal ideology is absolutely necessary, and so we cannot go on thinking that criminal law is a suitable instrument to deal with the problem of criminality. We have, as I write here, think about a radical shift of paradigm concerning legality, which it means to break the framework of the abstractions, to break the framework of penal ideology, and start to think concretely to the facts, to the subject, to the values who has to deal today with criminal justice. These kind of questions can be empirically analyzed in order to find the most suitable solution in the perspective of first, to protect human rights, and second, to give a suitable answer to the real needs, the needs of subjects, the needs of human relations, the needs of community. So we have to deal with different values, not violence, not revenge, solidarity, and social and strengthening social ties. Welfare, of course, is the first step to fight against poverty, but we have also to think about security as a common law. We can be rooted only on the base of a common sharing of the goods and a common protection of rights and basic needs of everybody. Without thinking in this direction, we will go on with the criminal law ideology to deal with absolutely untruth and unfounded system of managing the problem of illegalities and crimes, and we will get the only result to go through a worsening, more and more worsening situation of the crimes, just with the ideology to control them, but in a wrong way. Okay, so I think very shortly I try to say my idea. Okay.
I guess I have a question that may have already been answered, and this is for both either Aatika or Darien. Why do you think the carceral apparatus keeps reimagining itself and making itself better over time?
Darien, would you like to go first?
I was about to say you should take a stab at it.
No, I haven't heard before, so please.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a really deep deep question. I mean, I think because we can look at it on many levels, and obviously I have no more idea than anybody else here, so I feel almost silly trying to respond. But because if it didn't, then it would go out of existence. There's sort of an inherent like constant seeking for its own reification, its own reproduction, right? And because there's many people, as few as they may be in relation to the whole population, who are benefiting immensely, and who have been able to accumulate intergenerationally massive amounts of power, and they don't want to give it up, and so whether it's not necessarily there's like a council of people sitting around and thinking about how we're going to keep this happening or whatever, but there's a force that's self-reproducing, that seeks to the state, the main end of the state is itself. There's nothing it seeks beyond its own existence and its own power. So that's kind of how I would respond. but I'm interested in hearing other people's thoughts.
Okay, yeah, I think I do agree with Darien here. And I don't think I can speak on behalf of other communities across the globe that are having this experience of incarceration, specifically in the Indian context, apart from economic and legal systems that are shaped as per the majority. I think one thing that is very fundamental and at the base of the festering inequality, and I don't look at in the way of looking at it as a structure, but sort of also trying to look at it in the way of in the domain of cruelty, political cruelty, if I'm allowed to put it like that, and how any form of reinvention or expansion of any system that sort of works against the minorities, that keeps on festering because at the very root there's this impoverishment that needs to be replaced. I think from a minority perspective, my understanding that I locate impoverishment at the
Aatika, I believe that you are, your audio is breaking up and there's some background noise there.
Yes, I have extremely low bandwidth in my university.
Perhaps could you type the last two sentences that you said? I was unable to catch those.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Does anyone from the audience, we'd really love this to be a conversation. Does anyone have any personal experience or other ideas to address this concept?
Yeah, I'm doing technology, but I also want to ask a quick question because I'm just really curious about the distinction, and I'm not sure, maybe we can have it with a conversation with everybody. We don't have a lot of time, but the distinction between race and caste is really fascinating to me in relation to how it's conceptualized, how it works in different places. And that seems like yeah, it just seems like that there's distinctions, and if we think of it as if we think of it as yeah. So I'm just wondering if people have thoughts about that and how that might function.
And I just want to add quickly, if we could add Black and African to that, because I think Black and African is very different than race and caste and everything else. So question, just adding.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so yeah, again, coming back to what Louise asked and Sharon Cheryl added to the question, I think there is, of course, a lot of scholarship around the relationship between caste and race, and there have been arguments as well that moving abolition away from, or decentering abolition from Black African, or say the Black slavery or anti-Blackness does weaken this movement. But then one has to look at, and I think the link shared by one of the participants in the chat box is helpful there, about how, say, Brahmanism co-opts things around it. So I think I would really encourage people to look at that link, which has been shared in the chat box, which kind of reflects that if, say, for example, a Black African person kind of follows or chooses the Vedic way of life, then they might be treated as Brahmins or say upper caste. And in case they are not, or they do not choose that Vedic way of life, then they may either be looked at as, again, drug dealers, sex workers, or smugglers, or that, again, construction of criminalization which functions there. So that is how I think this interrelationship might function. I don't know how far I have been able to respond to those questions. Thanks.
Well, I'm still doing my research in terms of caste, but I do think that there is a distinction between the way people understand race and the way people understand anti-Blackness and anti-African sort of oppression. And the more and more I study and sort of and dive deeply into the topic, I'm realizing that there has to be a distinction made between quote unquote racism and quote unquote anti-Blackness or anti-African oppression. And that's because I think the way that the state deploys violence against people of Black and African descent is not the same as the way it'll do so against other marginalized communities. And for me, I think that the specificity of the Black and the African experience is key to really dismantling and abolishing carcerality. Because I think if we keep evading the Black person, evading the African experience, those complications that we embody, that the system puts on us, will continue to exist, and the system will work a lot better for non-Blacks. So I think for our solidarities to be effective, I think we really have to understand why the severity of oppression is so particularly for the Africans. And it's not to say that other people can't have the narratives and be part of the conversation, but I just think that if we don't center people of African descent or Black people, the system will just get better for non-Blacks, and we'll keep fighting the fight on our own. But thank you so much for this conversation.
So can I say something, Laura?
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is really fascinating to me because I haven't thought about it before. So I'm also like Cheryl, trying to figure out how this functions. I know that it was mentioned that Isabel Wilkerson's wrote this caste book, which is supposed to be about the U.S. and I haven't read it yet, and I'm going to put it on my list next. But the idea that how we conceptualize the issue is going to be it's going to be really important, right? If we conceptualize the issue from an Afro-pessimist kind of position, which suggests that Blackness has been a central feature of every formation of Western thought, then, as Wilkerson might suggest, then it makes sense that it's universalized, right? So that it actually continues from the beginning of Western thought in global interactions, and it continues to the very present. If we think of the relation of oppression as historical, and contingent, geographically and historically contingent, then it would suggest that it shifts and changes both in different geographies and different locations in such a way that they manifest and configure in different ways, so that it could configure differently in India as they might configure in South Asia. Now, I don't know, these are positions, right? So I'm not taking a position in relation to this, but I think that there's a tension in relation to conceptions that is being played out both in activist circles and in academic debates that is really key. So I just thought, to me, that tension seems really interesting and unresolved in my mind.
Any further ideas on this specific idea? Or we do have a comment from Carlin that I believe is directed more towards Darien's conversation. Carlin writes, I've been watching the police state KKK capitalism from the 50s, and they had the same mindset back then, but now that they have tech, they believe that they have become more powerful. But the police also seem to have tech, and folks like research presenters over the last few days also are more powerful to be able to document all their abuse and get out to a wider tip, which looks like a wash to me. So the question remains, what is to be done? Do any of our presenters have any reflection on that comment?
I don't have a specific reflection on that, but I think just because we have some more time, we'd all be remiss to not, I think, give our solidarity with the folks that are out in the streets right now over this past week, after what went down in Brooklyn Center, Chicago, Daly City, right? This kind of continuous war that we're pulled into. So definitely solidarity with all the rebels right now across the territory and across the world. That's one clear avenue around what is to be done.
What about this idea regarding the use of technology in positive ways? Do you think there is space for that?
I would love to hear other people's responses.
My response is brief. I think technology is inherently carceral. And for me, I think that at best, what we see is people tinkering and working with the limited options that we do have. But my answer would be there's no positive way to use the technology as it is configured and funded today.
I think we could look to the histories of where the kind of like the word commons comes from is often within an English context. We can connect that to the struggles of the Luddites, who took it upon themselves to break the machines that were put into the factories to increase the level of their exploitation, right? So very much in line with Sharon Cheryl's perspective here. We can learn from past struggles against technology.
Great, thank you. Well, we are at time and we have another event coming up here, but I would like to thank our presenters so much, as well as everyone who has contributed to this conversation. Please consider giving some feedback, and we hope to see you at future events today. Thank you all.